Okie dokie. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm here today with Wyatt Claypool, who has had a varied career in Canadian politics, from print media to political commentary on YouTube, as well as running for the federal Conservative Party nomination and helping organize a variety of campaigns in multiple provinces. Wyatt is the founder of the National Telegraph and is a current policy and communications advisor to the 1BC Party caucus in British Columbia. Wyatt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. So I would like to get started by introducing you a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about what initially drew you into political commentary and journalism, how you got involved with all that?
I guess I'm just a political hawk in general. I think the normal pipeline for young people getting into politics is that you start off very interested in history and then you get interested in political history. And then from listening to a lot of US political commentary shows, I eventually, started looking into the Canadian space where naturally over the past several years, the commentary community and even just the independent news community was still in sort of more of a smaller state at the time. It's much bigger now, but I just from being someone very interested in politics, very interested or just always liking to talk about it, naturally it was my outlet to just, be involved and feel involved in the conversation, and that ended up turning into more of an actual career both in commentary as well as political organizing.
That's awesome. So was it when you set out on this journey, was it your intention to build the following and the platform that you have today, or was that a surprise as it developed?
I actually started out as like I believe I was the federal conservative club president at Mount Royal University, and that turned into me being offered a gig writing for the Post Millennial back when it was still an exclusively Canadian online outlet. And then after leaving the Post Millennial, I ended up starting the National Telegraph, and I started purely print. So I had only written articles with maybe a couple podcasts here and there for 3.5 years. And then when Bill C-18 came out, the Online News Act, that totally cut off my ability to create, write articles and distribute them online. I then had to move over to YouTube. And so I guess I can thank Justin Trudeau for making me come out of my shell a little bit and become less nervous on camera, because now I've been doing this since October of 2023 up until the present day.
Oh my goodness. How was that journey from being print to being on YouTube? Have you experienced this like cancel culture? A lot of people, especially on YouTube, kind of talk about receiving backlash if they have more conservative or, non-popular views. Have you experienced that at all in your career?
If it's out there, I just don't tend to notice it. Like, definitely there are people who hate your guts, but my thing is I don't really care if people, hate me or love me. In fact, actually, my friend Daniel Boardman always has a great saying, or just like, I guess a good way of framing how people think about you online. If someone says, I love you, you're amazing, it just means I agree with you. And, I hate you, you should die, just means I disagree with you. But people are very colorful online. So I've never, I guess, yeah, I've had people try and smear me. I've had hit pieces written on me, especially when I ran for the Conservative Party nomination in Calgary Signal Hill. But, it's at the end of the day noise, and nothing's ever going to, be a kill shot on you unless you've actually done something wrong. And I've definitely not done anything demonstrably wrong in my entire political career.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, what about your decision to run for that particular seat in politics? I'm not as familiar with Canadian politics. I'm from the States, but would love to learn a little bit about what motivated you to run and kind of what that journey was like.
Well, I ended up running for a nomination for the riding of Calgary Signal Hill, which is a very safe conservative seat. So the nomination ends up effectively being the real election, just like a deep blue or deep red district in the United States. The primary ends up being the real election. And I was doing this at the same time I was starting up my YouTube channel. They almost kind of started up in tandem. Print was going away. I had to be on camera. I'm like, well, I already want to run for something, and this kind of pairs up well. People can see me being able to speak on the issues, and I think we need more people in politics who can actually speak very convincingly when it comes to policy issues and news issues. Whereas naturally, I think you get a lot of people who enter politics as the cap to their career. They're in business for a long time. They're lawyers. They're community leaders, and that's all great stuff. You need those things in politics, but naturally, you also don't have people who are specializing in communications getting involved. And I think we actually see why it's important when you see people like Jamil Javani and Andrew Lawton in the Conservative Party's caucus being able to speak very credibly on issues and being able to do it in a convincing way that makes people, maybe consider their positions who otherwise may have just passed over it because it just feels like another guy reading a press release. Those two can very much create content that drives voters on specific issues. So in Signal Hill, I even tried to. I'm not giving myself credit for doing this, but I was one of the people doing it when other people weren't. I was trying to pioneer running on a more, overtly immigration restrictionist policy, being more overt on running as somebody who's pro-life, trying to run with more bold tax reform policies, trying to, in a certain sense, prove that this works. Even if I did not become the candidate, I can go to other people and say, I've talked to people who are not diehard conservatives, and yes, I can message on these issues in such a way that makes people see our perspective. I didn't end up winning this nomination in Signal Hill, but it's not because of a lack of trying. I actually got kicked out arbitrarily, and when I say arbitrarily, they do not even give you a reason. And from background chatter, it was purely just insider nonsense that I hopefully will get rooted out in time. But I'm not crying about it. I've done a lot of things since then.
Fascinating. Very interesting. And how have you found balance between your like journalism career and your political career?
I'm openly biased. I don't act like I'm the news guy who's just telling you how things as they are. I try to, you try and be factual, but I am very open that I'm conservative. And what I've moved into is naturally more commentary. Will I break a story? Maybe here and there. Not very likely, but I will at times. I will, cover an issue that now that people aren't covering. Uh, but I've been on that side of it too, so I respect it quite a bit. I find that a lot of people don't really understand just how difficult it is to be a print journalist. You get a lot more accolades, honestly, when you're on YouTube and people can see your face and people tend to, see you as like one of their main people to hear about news issues from. But I've done stuff where it's been months of emailing back and forth with bureaucrats and developing a story and trying to expose an issue in government that other people haven't seen yet. So at one point in Alberta, I worked with this one the researcher David Dixon, and we ended up effectively exposing how poorly run the Alberta Health Service was during COVID, misusing ICU beds, not having enough available. At the same time, they say we're over capacity and this is justifying lockdowns. And we were showing that the numbers were constantly changing. They'd say we're at 90% capacity one day when they were only at 75% capacity. They were given the resources for 1,400 beds and they're using 300. And it was one of those things where I've, at least from doing that, actually helped cause change in government as an objective news guy. And now I'm trying to do it more from the commentary side of things. We actually, through that series, me and David Dixon, and I had this verified by the UCP and someone on the executive board of the party, that our reporting got like over 300,000 views, and it led to Jason Kenney firing Dr. Verna Yu, the then AHS CEO, the highest paid public employee in Canada at the time.
Oh my gosh, that is insane and good for you, I guess.
Well, I'm always jaded about that one because
Yeah.
I've never had anyone, nobody even knows about that one.
Well, see, now they do. All of the listeners here at We Unify, they will know. So, kind of talking about media, do you think that mainstream media outlets, specifically in Canada, still serve the public interest, and why or why not?
In a certain service level sense, they do. Naturally, as the CBC, when you get $1 billion a year, it's hard not to cover an issue properly, at least when it comes to the details. Where the mainstream media is really failing people is that, yeah, they give you the general details of news stories, but the amount of subtle commentary that's starting to enter their journalism is unacceptable, considering that they are paid quite a bit by taxpayers. And let's be clear, Rebel News Juno, the Western Standard, even legacy media outlets like the National Post are conservative, but people know that they're conservative. The thing that's kind of insidious with the CBC is that it's liberal while pretending like it's straight down the middle of the road. It's obviously not, and actually, I always thought the biggest weapon of the CBC is that it's so boring. Anyone still watching it couldn't possibly think that this is propaganda.
That's an interesting take on it. So, for somebody who is perhaps looking to find less biased media coverage in Canada, not necessarily conservative or, libertarian, liberal, what direction would you point them in? How would you encourage them to decipher what's real news and what's fake news?
You just have to read, I think, a variety of sources. I actually like having liberal outlets out there, especially because sometimes it actually confirms something is true once a liberal outlet promotes it. Once they publish an article on it, you can be pretty sure that something is a scandal for a liberal government once the Toronto Star starts finally talking about it. And I think that that's really how the news environment should work. It's that taxpayers don't have to pay for it. Maybe we can have a very low tax rate for news companies because it is hard to actually make a dollar in the industry because, you're trying to get people to subscribe to something where oftentimes the content is free anyways. But I think that's how people can avoid sort of entering an echo chamber. It's just read everything. Don't consider some people, here's the thing with the CBC and Global and the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail is that it's not fake news. 90% of the information is absolutely correct. It's the spin that you need to read more conservative outlets too in order to see what part's true, what part's the spin. Generally, when two outlets on the opposite side of the spectrum agree on certain details, you know that those things are true, and the rest is probably conjecture.
Interesting. And so, have you seen this kind of divide amongst media? Have you seen it get worse over the past couple years since COVID? Or do you think that people are kind of starting to wake up to the fact that, we can't necessarily take news as face value and it is important to do the research and to listen to both sides?
Well, if you look at, I'm going to keep going back and, beating the dead horse that is the CBC here. But whenever you look at public polling on how much people trust the public broadcaster, it's been going down precipitously for years and years and years. I think it ticked up a little bit, but that's just because of, sort of a rally around the flag effect because of the trade, the tariff, trade situation. For the most part, I think people are realizing that when you watch the CBC day in and day out, yeah, you get a very niche, you get a very narrow view of what's in the news. I'm referencing him again, but my friend Daniel Boardman on YouTube used to do an entire show called The Worst of the CBC, where the tagline was he watches the CBC so you don't have to. And I did some of those videos with him every once in a while, and you have to watch an entire episode of The National preparing to shoot one of those things, and it is torture realizing that, oh goodness, it's the fourth time that they're covering this one extremely niche, socially progressive issue in a 45-minute newscast. Like 20 minutes of a newscast is sometimes talking about, some like issue about gender equality or whatever, like somebody was, misgendered on the bus or whatever in Vancouver. 18 minutes later, we're still talking about it. You'd have to be pretty progressive to not realize that this might not really be what the news is in this country day to day.
Absolutely. That it seems a little extreme. That's a long time to talk about a very small issue. So, are there other examples like this that you are kind of seeing a pattern within media where, I guess, to use your expression, they're kind of beating a dead horse, where they're presenting news that's not really news? They're just trying to get an emotional response out of their audience?
Well, I would actually say a big development in legacy media over the past, I'd say maybe 3 to 5 years, is how hostile they've become to independent media. Some people accept independent media as a legitimate, new vein of the media landscape, but you get some people who are deeply upset that the independent media is now around and, being able to go into press conferences just as they are. We saw this at the leaders debate where people were very upset that Rebel News and Juno and the Western Standard were present because they're not legitimate. And you look at some of the people complaining, it's like just because you've been around longer, because your outlet's been around longer, doesn't make you a better journalist. Your command of the facts and your ability to present them is what makes you a journalist. But it really does come down to the idea that, like, don't you recognize, like, don't you know who we are kind of attitude has very much come out. The idea that, like, this very eye rolling, aggressively eye rolling attitude from people like, Andrew Coyne, about the fact that Rebel News and Juno and people like me doing commentary on YouTube are allowed to have opinions. Not that he's in favor of censorship, but just the idea that we should be regarded as less than automatically because we don't get paid handsomely to sit on the CBC news panels and give mild opinions about things like he does.
It's so interesting that they still have that attitude because I mean, the stats kind of speak for themselves. Independent journalists and commentators are clearly gaining traction. Like that's the kind of thing that people want to hear. So it's interesting that I don't know if they're in denial or they just, disrespect. That's fascinating to me.
Here's the thing with the average CBC reporter. Maybe not the average, but in terms of the ones, I'll back it up a little bit. You would be shocked just how unprofessional the average legacy media journalist is. I'm not trying to be insulting, but these people are being paid full-time salaries and they maybe put out a couple articles a week just reporting on something that could have easily been found by just going onto your local city council's Facebook page. People are paid to sit in their sweatpants at home and crank out two very by the numbers articles. You contact the same experts you always contact. You contact the city councilors in your town to talk about some issue that's, local or whatever. And there's a place for that. I'm not sure if the CBC needs the $1 billion to cover these issues worse than somebody with a Facebook feed in the community. But it's absolutely baffling how much money goes into putting out so little content that nobody reads, by the way. No doubt the CBC has a lot of viewership, but it's hard not to have viewership being on several channels across the country and having oftentimes reprinting the same articles along, CBC Calgary and CBC Edmonton and Montreal and National and whatnot. That, yeah, they get views, but compared to their budget, the views are nothing. Their audience capture is like 3.5% of people will even bother watching them in a given week. And when you actually look at their budget and you size it up for what an American outlet would have, they are in fact bigger than Fox News in terms of the budget. It's like $1 billion, $1.2 billion a year plus their revenues from ads, because how could you not bring in ad revenues with that much money? And Fox News has like a budget of 7 billion or something like that, but naturally Canada's population is, a little bit more than 10% of the Americans' population. And when you take into account the ratio, we actually have a much bigger budget than Fox News at the CBC.
That is so interesting. And they still just don't have a very consistent following despite all that.
Name a famous CBC host right now other than Rosemary Barton.
Huh. I mean, I wouldn't know, but our listeners certainly would. So to kind of
You have just as good of a chance of being able to name somebody as a Canadian does.
Okay, well, there you go. See, a good example. They are not being listened to as much as they think they are. Oh my. Okay, so transitioning a little bit from talking about journalism to conservative Canada and politics a little bit, what is your take on the current state of the conservative movement in Canada?
I think that on policy issues, it's moving in the right direction. When it comes to grassroots democracy, I think there is still a lot of work to be done. I would characterize this last federal election as the Conservatives generally having the right ideas on policy, although I think they went mild in a lot of areas. You don't just say, the Liberals are proposing a 1% rate reduction in taxes under 50,000. Well, we'll give two and a quarter. I was saying to somebody in the Conservative Party just about a week ago, like it has to be a 20% overall cut across the board. Take 3 points off of people's taxes across the entire board, or you just seem liberal light on that issue. On immigration, I think Pierre Poilievre has gotten the right position post-election now that we need a net negative migration flow. During the election, it was, the liberals are going to bring in 395,000 new permanent residents per year. We are going to bring in only 200 to 250,000. It's like average voter doesn't even really make a sophisticated difference between those two numbers because in a certain sense, it's like a big problem or a medium-sized problem. It's like who's the person saying that we should just do it better? But overall, the conservatives still had the better platform, and I think that policy they're doing the right things when it comes to how they run the campaigns, being more grassroots in how they pick candidates. Like in my case, don't kick people out, and being more grassroots in how the campaigns are run. That's where I think that a lot of Canadian conservatives need to catch up with, American conservatives, uh, the people like Charlie Kirk, who are truly able to, even as somebody who's not a politician himself, drive out voters because of the very local approach to how politics is done. We have too much of a national approach, and it's frankly because Canadian parties have a very hierarchical structure. If the leader in their team wants to do a thing, everyone's doing that thing. When that's not really what you should be doing when you're in the second largest country by landmass.
So, what are some practical steps that Canadians or Canadian politicians can take to kind of encourage the growth of those grassroots movements and individuals?
I would say that you just need to get away from just being a press release politician. Almost you like take my job from me. Go and become your own local commentator. Become the guy who has opinions on things, and it's not just, don't just put out stiff statements about issues. Become a figure in the community. You're not just the member of parliament, be a community organizer too. Be the guy who's actually, writing articles on this stuff and doing your own analysis. Don't just wait for your, assistants to help you put together some sort of, press release on the deficit. Be constantly engaged in the issues, where I find oftentimes parties will sound off about something and then we're on to the next issue. I see parties do this a lot provincially, that this week the theme is talking about crime, and they just do that. Everything's again very stiff. They're moving like a tank in the way that they do politics. And it's like politics, especially in a country this big, is a guerrilla war. Every riding needs a guy who's modeling himself based on what the people in the riding want. A suburban conservative is going to be much different than a rural conservative, and they're going to be even more different than an urban conservative politician. You just have to let you have to kind of let the people around you decide what kind of politician you're going to be. And I'm not saying in like an overly populist kind of a way where just do whatever people want. Obviously stick to your principles, but connect with people, create videos, actually, take on hard issues, win fights, and prove that you're somebody that people can rely on. Where I think people are needing to step away from the risk management style of political campaigning that's very popular in Canada right now. That the ultimate goal is for nothing to have been done wrong in a day. It's like, well, nothing's ever done right that way as well.
Absolutely. And so, how would you encourage the day to day people to get more involved in being voices for their politicians and kind of helping the politicians understand exactly what these unique districts want? Like you said, it looks different in a rural area than it would a suburban area. But from what I've heard from other speakers, there tends to be difficulty in organizing voices and helping people reach the resources they need to actually speak to their politicians. So, how would you advise they proceed to be able to achieve that?
Part of it is that some people have genuinely do need to be less on social media because it's an echo chamber at the end of the day. The people who are most likely to agree with you are on social media. You need to get out and see people in your local area and be able to prove to your local officials, I can go out there and do this for you in part and show you here's 300 names of people who say they agree with me on this issue. Now sit down and talk to me. That is where you're going to get change, in effect being threatening to a politician, showing I could out organize you if you don't move on this thing. I can prove to you that this is something that you need to be on. It's kind of a do it yourself thing. If no one's doing it, you have to do it, and then you have to force people to then follow you by, showing how devastating it could be if they don't jump on board this particular issue, demonstrating that there is an appetite for this. Whereas you can't just be the person forwarding emails to a dozen MLAs every single day and assuming that someone will eventually read your 2,000-word essay.
Mm, fair enough. And so I feel like this is a good segue to kind of talk about the We Unify in Reclaiming conference, because kind of what we're seeking to do is provide opportunities for the everyday people to come in and learn from people like you, from our other speakers, and to talk to one another. So, what was it that originally piqued your interest in getting involved with the Reclaiming conference this year?
Well, my friend and fellow commentator Frank Vaughn out in Saskatchewan ended up inviting me, and I was just interested in being able to have, be on panel with other people. And I think one of the I don't know. I think one of the best things for people who are either watching online or wanting to attend in person is being able to see the different speakers who they know in a very particular context on their own shows, or from their own outlets or from their own particular areas of politics or culture, coming together and bouncing ideas off of one another. It's not always that you're going to come to a conclusion at the end of the day and we're going to all have said we learned this specific thing. Sometimes I think the best thing to learn is just how to take ideas and, kind of consume them in terms of how to kind of mull about an idea, how to kind of turn it over in your hand, and kind of learning how, even just seeing how different personalities bounce off one another. That's always kind of the interesting thing about these conferences. People that you don't usually see together are now interacting, and well, how does that change how these people talk and speak just seeing them together?
Mhm. And would you say that it's important for these kind of conversations to be held in person versus, over Zoom or over a phone call?
Oh goodness, especially over social media replies to each other. Yeah, because when you're in person, I think you have to speak at a specific pace. I can't. I'll admit I watch blood sport debates sometimes on YouTube between different creators, mostly in the United States. It's not the most productive. It can be entertaining, but that's not how actual human beings talk to each other in person. And I think that you get better ideas and better commentary cutting through when you're up on stage with people in real life, and uh, there is kind of I don't know. It's just like the social aspect. People's ideas tend to get sharpened when it's the more serious space of we're actually in front of each other in real life, not just it's sitting on a Zoom call and we're all one of 180 tiny little windows.
Mhm. I could not have said it better myself. And ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. It is super important to participate in these conversations in person. It does make a difference. So if you want to be a part, I highly encourage you to check out our website, weunified.ca, where you can get all the details for our Reclaiming Conference taking place in Calgary, Alberta, this upcoming September 19th through 21st. Wyatt will be there. We have a bunch of incredible speakers, and we would love to see you all join us as well. Thank you so much for your time, Wyatt, and all the awesome info. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, I'll look forward to seeing everyone there.